here, back with another video, this time with the tier list for Genshin. This tier list will encompass everything Pre-Mavuika, including Xiaolong and including Chasca and Ororon. But before we jump right into the tier list, I have a few things to note. For this tier list, I have expanded the tiers just a bit. I have so many different characters right now that I want to show the minor disparity between each of them a bit better. But all of these characters are playable. Keep that in mind. The difference between an S+ tier and an F tier is that an S+ tier character can clear content significantly easier than an F tier character, and they could do it much more consistently. An F tier character can still clear, but you're going to have to put in either so much more effort, or you're going to have to put in vertical investment in order to get them to clear, and even then, it's not going to be super consistent. That's the main difference. And to show the disparity for each tier, I'm going to have a plus and minus version of each tier other than F. If a character is in one of the plus tiers, it means that they have a bit more in their kit than a character below them. Think of similar team damage, but less reliant on teams, plus easier to use, making them more consistent. If a character is in the minus tier, it would be the opposite, though each character in each tier should be considered as part of their respective letter. There is more of a difference between each letter than there is between plus or minus. But now to explain the tiers themselves. F tier is the lowest tier possible. Characters in this tier are usually not worth investing into because of multiple issues in their kit. You can definitely still use these units, but you're going to have to rely on multiple 5-star weapons and team comps and or extreme skill in order for them to get the max clear objectives in Spiral Abyss and Imaginarium Theater. B tier are those that are still not the best, but these units do still have their specific situations in which they can excel. Those situations are quite rare though, in which case, most of the time, they will be on par with an F tier character. C tier characters are those that have quite a few comps and that can clear easily, or those that are super versatile, but might be pretty reliant on stronger characters to clear easily. These characters can also end up clearing as well, if not better than some characters in higher tiers, but they require one comp, and that one comp will usually come with caveats due to issues with the character's kit. B tier is really where we start seeing the stronger characters. This tier will host some very consistent characters that can clear many endgame game modes with ease. Their downside is one specific issue that holds them back from being amazing, plus a few other minor issues. A tier is a step up, as each of these units offers their respective team comps large benefits. These units have so many pros to their kit that any of the cons they have don't matter, but they still do not excel. S tier units are those that go above and beyond. They are consistently one of the best in their class for many teams, and they have pretty much no downside. They might revolve around a mechanic, but they usually come with enough power that they will still be one of the best units in the game for most teams. These units are the staple characters that have taken over the game. Also note that certain classes of characters are better and more versatile than others. For example, sub-DPS units have access to their damage constantly and provide elemental application and maybe buffs from off-field. This makes them usable in so many different teams that the better ones will become staples on an account. A main DPS, on the other hand, does not constantly have access to their damage and must be used on field. This is a huge limit to these characters since excessive use of them would decrease team damage dramatically. So if you are wondering why supports are at the very top and main DPS seem to fall below, that's why. The order in which we discuss the characters will be based on their release date, but characters that were released in 1.0 will be ordered alphabetically. So let's start off with Amber. Amber is a mess of a character since she has no blatant objective in mind. That's her real issue, is it makes her completely reliant on Elegy and the new scroll artifact set, or the instructor set, for her to support herself and her team. She's great for the fast pyro application, but her application had dummy short duration, making her useful only for damage per screenshot showcases. She did get slightly buffed by the release of Mualani because she is one of Mualani's best LG buffers. However, she is usually only used as a free-to-play speed-running unit alongside an end character to enable melt and vape speed-running, making her still a contender for the worst character in the game. Barbara is first and foremost a healer, but that's not really her main use case. Ever since Dendro's release, Barbara has been best used as a bloom driver due to her team-wide sustain and innate hydro infusion. However, she lacks good sustaining uptime. She is one of the 3 characters that cannot battery her team, and she lacks damage. She's just a Nilo bloom driver with nothing else going for her, and she's very easily replaced by the likes of Xingqiu, Yuan, Furina, Candace, any other hydro character, honestly, who could all just do her job better, but some without sustain. Beidou is a sub-DPS unit with pseudo-defensive utility. She used to struggle a lot because she has an insane energy requirement, which is why Fischl was and still is her best teammate. But over time, she received buffs to her damage potential that enabled her to run more energy and less offensive stats. Aggravate granted her a base damage increase, Furina granted her her percent damage, and Chevreuse offered Wolf plus Electro Resistance Shred, which each buffed her damage so high that she can now run purely energy recharge with crit stats and still reach some large damage values. On top of that, her damage mitigations and shield end up pairing incredibly with the tanky on-field units we have received from Fontaine, specifically Arlecchino and Chlorinde. All of these factors buffed her not significantly, but to the point where she can be considered a rather strong and pretty versatile unit, even if using the Favoni's Greatsword, which is very good. Now with Bennett. Bennett is a very powerful healer and team buffing support that has been more relevant than ever in Fontaine. While Furina might have wanted team-wide healers, Bennett's healing is so large that it's usually enough to activate Furina's team-wide healing, which enables her to be used. These two have turned out to be such a stable core that almost every single attack scaling main DPS unit is fighting for this duo. Chongyun has a very interesting kit. His Cryo Infusion is currently not useful on anyone without a C6 Shenhe, and the small attack speed increase makes zero difference for all characters unless they have additional attack speed increases. His personal damage is also merely just a few instances of damage from his burst, after which he needs to be used as a main DPS to deal damage, but his damage is low and his Cryo Infusion has a range requirement. He has only ever been relevant when the community first discovered the national comp, but then the community discovered that this comp would be better with literally anybody else, and we have since moved on from this popsicle-loving Ghost Snatcher. Chongyun simply does not offer enough utility to team to be relevant, and he lacks almost any damage. At this point, you have to run him as a hypercarry with Furina, Bennett, and Xiangling as a Pyro Plunge DPS, else he'd be contributing to nothing to the team. And now we're on to Diluc. Perfect timing considering the team comp. Diluc is a Pyro main DPS who got massively buffed with the introduction of Xiangling. When paired with Furina, Xiangling, and Bennett, his large plunging attack damage multiplier can finally be utilized to the fullest. His main issue is that this is his only comp in the game at the moment that truly enables him. Without this comp, he cannot keep up with other units in the game due to his lower damage values and uptime. With this comp, he would be an A tier DPS, but without it, he'd be in about C tier, averaging out to the B tier placement I have him in. Now time for Fischl. Fischl is a monster. She's an incredibly powerful sub-DPS character. Fontaine's launch allowed us to farm a new artifact set that buffed elemental skill damage by 70%, while also granting us Furina later on, which basically did the same thing. Fischl ate these buffs up, and her damage got undercutted into the stratosphere due to her ability to constantly trigger Aggravate, and since almost all of her damage counts as elemental skill damage, it's to the point that she has one of, if not the highest damage outputs of any off-field unit in the game. On top of that, she generates some of the most energy in the game, rivaling the literal god of energy generation, but her energy gen comes from off-field. Fischl is insane like she always has been. She won so hard that I'm considering her without a shadow of a doubt the best Electro character in the game. Diona is a team-wide healing support that has always been decent, but became very relevant from Furina's release, which massively buffed the usefulness of team-wide healers. This boosted Jean's viability and propelled her to the top 5 best defensive supports in the game on Furina's arrival. While that may not be the case anymore, Jean is still a very strong defensive support that can work well in many situations. Kaeya, unfortunately, has not received great treatment from Fontaine. Kaeya is a sub-DPS cryo unit that was a prominent pick in Fridge-related teams due to his incredibly fast cryo application. However, those have become more irrelevant than ever before due to their lower damage. Furina increased the damage floor and ceiling of almost every single team in the game, but none of those teams want Kaeya. Despite that, he's still a pretty decent off-field unit that can work well in freeze-related competition. Keqing is a great quick-swappy DPS with Aggravate. Furina's release increased damage of her teams, but not as much as others. This is due to the fact that it's hard to find a spot to fit Furina in Keqing's teams due to the additional hydro application, loss of Fischl, and need for a healer. While it still can be done, it ends up not being as much of a DPS increase as other teams have received, which puts her in B. Lisa is a buffing support unit with some sub-DPS capabilities. She gets a lot of crap, and it is for good reason. However, she does offer defense reduction on enemies and can buff an ally's attack with Thrilling Tales or generate energy with Favoni's Codex, while also using the new scroll artifact set for the 12% team-wide damage buff. While that is not a lot, it is still something and ends up making her a decent substitute to Beidou, Kujou Sara, and Fischl if you don't have them. One thing to note about Lisa is that she is currently one of the only characters who can reduce the defense of enemies, which makes her incredibly powerful in teams where raw stat values are through the roof. I'm mentioning this because Lisa is one of the current best buffing supports for Quick Bloom teams since raw base damage, crit stats, and percent damage values are so high. This means that she could potentially get a larger buff from the release of the last 2 Archons, but only time will tell. Luna is the damage per screenshot unit. She's able to massively buff the damage dealt by the team to enemies she she hits, though the duration on this is unrealistically short. She also has incredibly low hydro application, making her terrible in many comps that want anything other than a buffing support. She simply does one thing really well, however, that one thing is not valuable at the moment. Ningguang is a quick swap DPS unit that is deserving the D+ tier. If Navia was a mountain, Ningguang would be a pebble. These two are basically the same character, except Ningguang has significantly lower stats than what Navia has, with nothing else at benefit. She's a simple Geo DPS that cannot do her job nearly as well as other DPS can. Noelle is a hybrid main DPS and team-wide defensive support unit who Fiorina buffs the living daylights out of. Her ability to act as a main DPS, shielder, and team-wide healer can be found in no other unit, and it's what sets her apart from the rest of the cast. Her versatility is incredible, but she relies on Fiorina for usability at the moment. Without her, Noelle can struggle to reach team DPS outputs as even the likes of mid-tier units, putting her in this slot. Now for Qiqi, we're going to put her in D-. This is a drastic change from my last tier list, but honestly I think I was way too happy with her as a healer. And while she did perform much better than Mika at half the level he was, he does not anymore. Her inability to battery, her low uptime without Sacrificial Sword, and her lack of damage without the Clam set are all massive drawbacks that make her underwhelming. She used to be better than some supports, but that's simply not the case anymore. She's back to poo tier now, but if they messed up once, they'll do it again. You'll rise again, Qiqi. I believe in you. The main DPS, Razor, is deserving of the D+ tier. He was another one of those units that was honestly very good back in Sumeru, but the land of transformative reactions is over, as we're now in the raw damage buffing era. Sadly, Razor's base scalings are pretty awful. While he still can clear pretty well with his full elemental mastery team, it's not the same as it used to be. I'm gonna miss you, buddy. Sucrose is a buffing support unit who is like Kazuha, but mechanically worse. Sucrose's only off-field presence is her elemental burst, which has a small AoE and its elemental infusion can be finicky, so she might have a hard time applying the correct elements. She also has a longer on-field window than most other supports due to her need to use 2 or 3 elemental skills plus her elemental burst, which incentivizes her to be used as an on-field driver over an off-field support. Her main benefit is the insane amount of elemental mastery she can grant her entire team, which stays useful due to the absurd amount of damage percent and other stats we currently have in the game, and because all OG transformative reactions just got their base damage massively buffed. Both these factors largely increase the potency of more elemental mastery, since most other buffs are currently at such a huge amount that they've reached hard diminishing returns, with elemental mastery being about just as useful as it was in the 1.x days or even more so. Sucrose has a guaranteed spot as one of the best in slot buffing support units for a large variety of compositions. For the Traveler, like last time, I'm going to split them into 2 characters. Lumine will be the Dendro Traveler, and Aether will be every other Traveler, because every Traveler other than the Dendro Traveler is pretty bad. All versions of the Traveler are support units, and most are in the same tier. Each offer minor buffs, and there's something inconvenient about them. Anima pushes enemies away from you and requires long on-field time. Geo maxes out the amount of constructs you can have with ease. Electro requires you to pick up items they drop, and Hydro requires a long on-field time, and their hydrocation moves away from enemies. Most Travelers are the worst in their field, and are some of the worst characters in the game. The Dendro Traveler, however, is the only version of this character that is of any good. They offer good damage buffs and consistent off-field Dendro application to Quicken and Bloom teams. They're only contested by Nahida in this sense, which is insane to think about. There's simply no character other than the Archon Dendro that competes with the Dendro Traveler. This makes them one of the best off-field Dendro units in the game, still after 2 years. Their main downside is their lack of damage, which did not benefit much from Fiorina. Venti is honestly in a pretty decent spot right now. He's a sub-DPS unit that has been getting buffed recently, as there's usually one side of the abyss that he's viable in. On top of that, Imaginarium Theater benefits units with high raw value, not based on the team. This means that Venti is usually a pretty strong go-to whenever he's available in Imaginarium Theater, especially in the first floors, and if you're trying to thin the herd of characters that you dislike. He also benefits all these new units that have small AoEs, as he allows them to actually make use of these AoEs. Venti might not be as overpowered as he used to be, but he's now pretty good, though still kind of niche. Xiangling is deserving of the S tier. Xiangling is a sub-DPS pyro applicator that I rated kind of low in my last tier list video, because she didn't really benefit from anything while everyone around her got buffed. She even still relied on Bennett, which to me made her much more underwhelming than pre-Sumeru Xiangling. However, she has received a massive buff from Fontaine because of all the units in the game that now need harsh pyro application. Xiangling has the best off-field pyro application in the game, has been uncontested tested for years, and finally she is being used specifically for it. On top of that, she also benefits harshly from Fiorina, which, in addition to my last point, shoots her to the S tier where she belongs. Alongside her is Xingqiu. Xingqiu, the all-purpose off-field unit, has been the best character in the game for way too long, but finally he has been knocked off of his high horse. The addition of Fiorina meant teams no longer needed to rely on Xingqiu for harsh off-field hydro application. While he still does offer a lot to the team, he is no longer the it man, as Fiorina could usually do the job herself, and even if she couldn't, Yolan would be enough. Despite his fall from the best unit in the game, he's still up there as one of the best. Klee is a main DPS driver that has had little impact on the game. She was a strong DPS on launch, but she's now extremely outdated and clunky. However, she can very easily enable Fiorina to vaporize consistently, which no other character can do as well. This puts her in a very odd position as a Fiorina-specific buffer. However, the opposite is also true, as Fiorina can now massively boost the damage of Klee to be what it was always meant to be. Despite this synergy, Klee still has underwhelming numbers that just don't do well enough in today's day and age unless you have her C2. Diona got shafted by the release of Fontaine. She has always been a stable all-around defensive support, and the 200 elemental mastery buff she offered the on-field unit had insane value too. However, she has fallen behind other defensive supports as her healing is not enough to keep up with Fiorina's needs and due to her lack of damage. She's still one of the best 4-star defensive supports, but defensive supports now also need to be offensive, which Diona can never be. Now with Tartaglia, my boy. Oh, he has fallen from grace. Tartaglia is a great main DPS unit if you plan to use him purely as a hydro enabler. However, a lot of teams right now do not benefit from this type of on-field support, which has slowly left Tartaglia behind. Despite that, his stable international comp is still freaking incredible, though now boring and outdated while also slowly falling behind. Xinyan is the main DPS who received very little from the introduction of Fiorina other than the new plunging attack hypercarry vape comp that she, Chongyun, and Bennett enable. However, Xinyan is not the best at these and requires this at a base level to be usable as a main DPS, just like with Chongyun. Mualani's release has brought out a new light into this character though, as she is one of Mualani's best off-field support units. Xinyan offers Mualani the second fastest off-field pyro application in the game for her to vaporize off of, while also granting Mualani a decently thick shield to keep Mualani from getting knocked around. But this is just one single main DPS, and one other comp where she can be a main DPS. Otherwise, she performs significantly worse than other units, though these facts do push her out as a contender for one of the worst characters in the game, which is quite nice. Zhongli, oddly enough, has been doing quite well. He is weirdly super relevant in this healer meta we are now in. This is because of his ability to shred all type resistances for both the main DPS and Fiorina. Zhongli is so good in this spot right now that he enables one of the best hypercarry team cores in the entire game. Despite that, I don't think it's enough of a reason to move him up much, as it just does not offer his team powerful enough buffs to keep him relevant. Albedo is going into C+. While Albedo did get buffed from the introduction of the Golden Artifact set, it was a minor buff and he got little else. Albedo received probably the shortest end of the stick imaginable from Fontaine, since he got kicked out of his best comp by his female duplicate, Chiori, and he got kicked out of his plunging attack focused pseudo niche by Xiangyun. Hoyover's gotta stop hurting my boy. The only thing he has left right now is decent raw damage output and a decent elemental mastery buff, which is not enough anymore to contend with other units who are getting their damage amped through the roof. Albedo needs something, and if not done, he's probably going to fall into D tier next week. Ganyu is going into B+. She is a very versatile DPS unit who will always be relevant due to her good raw damage, quadratic scaling, supportive capabilities, and permanent uptime, everything she has. Due to Fiorina, she also gained access to some odd burn melt vape comps that launched her damage to new heights. Ganyu's good, and she always will be, simply due to how her kit is designed. Xiao is going to be right alongside her. Xiao is a hypercarry that received major buffs during Fontaine, as he's now dealing with brand new build options. Marais Chaussee enabled him to build less crit, Yangyun granted him flat buffs to his plunges while also healing the entire team passively, and Fiorina massively boosts his and Faruzan's damage up the wazoo. Xiao ate well and has seen a good amount of relevance as one of the better DPS units for the first half of Fontaine. However, he still has energy issues and single target damage issues, and without his new best team, he cannot keep up with the best DPS in the game. Hu Tao is the final member of the initial Liyue Big 3, but unlike the others, she has received some huge buffs to her damage from Fiorina, Ballad of the Fjords, and Marais Chaussee, and due to Fiorina's ridiculous damage boosting capabilities, she can now ignore her anti-heal team building restriction. This enables Hu Tao to use units like Jean, Bennett, and most importantly, Xiangyun as defensive supports. The final one is more important because she grants Hu Tao a new playstyle that rivals the damage boost her C1 granted her. Hu Tao got massive love in Fontaine, which allowed her to continue as one of the best DPS in the game. Rosaria is going to go into B tier. Rosaria is a sub-DPS buffing support who received nothing of note. She is simply a massive crit rate buffer and sub-DPS that can work well in any cryo-related team. She doesn't stand out, nor does she fall behind. She's just a good, stable unit, and I think that's where she will end up being until this game eventually dies. Yanfei is in C tier. She is a main DPS who received nothing really of note other than the ability to now use Fiorina and Marais Chaussee just like everyone else. She still relies solely on her good but not large damage, and she comes with very little utility, putting her below everyone else. This also includes Klee, who Yanfei used to be about just as good as, but now Klee has her pretty good Virgin teams, and she also pairs insanely well with Fiorina since she doubles Fiorina's damage output. Yanfei just can't do this, which is why she's now below Klee. Now time for Eula, who's still a bad unit, but I don't believe she is the worst 5-star nor the worst 5-star main DPS in the game, which can be a good thing based on perspective. These two titles will go to 2 other units later on, but this right now is about Eula. The reason why she's so low is that her main issue of wasting her top tier damage potential is still prevalent. Her kit is simply just fundamentally flawed due to the consequences that come with backloaded damage. Units like these never last long and will always be worse than those that get their damage up front. She needs to up her damage that has a low AoE that can trigger when no enemies are nearby or overkill those present. Each of these things make her damage output erratic, making her one of the most inconsistent DPS units in the game. Ending off the first year of Genshin, we have Kazuha. Kazuha is still an absolutely broken support and sub-DPS hybrid. While he may have been made a bit less relevant due to Fiorina's ability to match and surpass his damage buffing potential, he does not need to rely on healers, and he still absolutely trivializes AoE content all on his own. Kazuha is still busted, and while he may not be a contender for the best unit in the game anymore, he's definitely up there where he will stay most likely forever. Starting off with Inazuma, we have Ayaka. Ayaka's primary function is that of a main DPS. While she was a very powerful unit for the longest time, the game is finally punishing her very flawed kit. Ayaka needs groups to be stationary in order for her elemental burst to deal all of its damage. The Snow Princess has fallen behind mostly due to the increase in enemies that are super mobile, who can easily aid her elemental burst, and the increase in mobile bosses for those with multiple invulnerability windows. She's been struggling a bit recently to the point where I'd say it's only worth using her if you have a strong grouping support. Ayu is going into C-. Since she is a support unit that never gets buffed. I don't know why, but she never does, and it's been hurting her for a long time. Ayu has no grouping capabilities, low AoE, split scaling, and rather low scaling values. She might be a healer, but it's only single target healing, and her healing is not enough in a lot of cases, making her incredibly underwhelming. Yoimiya is the single target damage queen. Her damage in these situations is still some of the best in the game. However, she has many inconsistencies. She needs to be protected by a shield, else her attack chain would get interrupted, ruining her correct reaction triggering, and she needs her damage to be massively buffed to keep up with the newer units. However, currently her best teams are not consistent since she needs to be used without a shield, and she can't reliably trigger Virgin. But if you do use her safer team, she'd be lacking in damage output. She's unnecessarily conditional for a main DPS, which is a shame since she cannot deal with AoE situations. However, oddly enough, she ended up becoming one of Mualani's best supports, because her elemental burst does end up tying in perfectly with Mualani's kit, which is a very nice and odd buff. Aloy is another character that makes little sense. She's a bow DPS that needs to rely on the enemy to step over multiple of her elemental skill spells in order for her to deal damage, else she'd just be a burst DPS unit. She could technically use Elegy, but she cannot reliably activate the passive every rotation due to her reliance on enemies for damage, and her damage scaling value are too low to deal damage. She's also the only unit in the game with no constellations, so there's no hope in maybe making her stronger, making her, in my opinion, the worst character in the game. Kujou Sara is up next, and she goes into C- tier. Sara is an electro-specific attack buffing support with multiple issues. Her attack buff is pretty large, but her main issue is that her buffing potential is incredibly strict. It only benefits electro units, it only benefits attack scaling units, and it is purely single target oriented, making her buff worth it only on a hyper carry Raiden Shogun. Most other units can rely on the aggravate reaction for their damage, which doesn't need to be built into. Though if it is built into, it can be even better than Sara's buff. At the moment, Sara is falling behind, especially since characters like Bennett and Chevreuse can do her job while also acting as offensive support. Despite that, Sara's not bad, as these three can pair insanely well together, buffing attack scaling electro main DPS units like Raiden and Chlorant. But outside of that niche, she is purely outclassed. Now for Raiden Shogun, who goes up into the A+ tier. Raiden is a driver that fell off quite a bit from Sumeru. When Dendro was released, she was able to act as a strong main and sub-DPS unit due to Aggravate and Hyper Bloom while also buffing the team. However, not many units came out post Inazuma that relied on their burst or damage and had high energy requirements. Raiden also has a massive crap ton of damage percent at her disposal, which ended up diluting the extra damage percent Fiorina granted. These negatives raised Raiden's damage ceiling by less than many other main DPS units, making her less useful than she has been in the past. It's to the point that I believe there to be little reason to pull her now, if not aiming for C2 or C3, as Fischl can do her battery job just as well from off-field, while Kuki can act as the Hyper Bloom damage dealer plus healer. But despite that degradation in pull value, I still think that she is one of the better characters in the game, and definitely a near must-pull if you don't have any other near must-pull units. Kokomi's story is pretty sad. On Fiorina's release, many dropped the 5-star healer Kokomi since Fiorina did what she could, but better. Fiorina offers slow hydro application that's mobile and grants large damage percent boosts to the team that only relies on a healer to be active. Kokomi's main use case got power crept. However, she still stands as a rather decent pick in many teams as a solid defensive support, attack buffer, and percent damage buffer combo. Koma is next in the C tier. Koma is a normal attack focused shield support that is not that great of a spot right now. This is due to its strong but inconsistent shield that requires many normal attacks to stack up, high energy requirement, low pyro application, and low buffing potential. Koma was great for Burgeon, but in those situations, Kaeya and Xiangling became the better picks since the former's application is not reliant on normal attacks, while the latter enabled burning as well for vape shenanigans. Koma got kicked back to the wayside yet again for other characters who are more favored in this meta. Arataki numero Ito is another hyper carry main DPS like Xiao, and just like Xiao, he got many upgrades this year. Ito received a massive buff to his team damage through the likes of 2 female Geo supports in Chiori, who acted as direct power creep to Albedo, and Jalonin, who acted as both direct power creep to Zhongli and enabled Fiorina to be used with Ito for even more of a damage boost. This damage boost is huge, but any other unit can use the exact same basic team, which means every team got the same damage boost. So Ito stays in the same spot he was in even before all of the buffs, which is kind of sad. This makes Ito a rather underwhelming unit, especially since many other teams can do what he can, but significantly more consistently. While Ito may be in the slums, his twink dog is out thriving as per usual. Goro is so good because of his massive damage buffs to defense scaling Geo characters. While this does sound very niche, it's actually quite common, as about 2/3 of the higher Geo roster are also defense scalers. This puts him in the prime position to be the best support buffer for a majority of the Geo class, which is why he's up this high. If you want to build a Geo DPS in the future, there's a high likelihood that Goro is gonna be alongside them, and at that point you have to build Goro too. Shenhe is another niche buffing support, but she's not great currently. This is because of Fiorina, who blatantly took her spot. There's no spot in the game that Shenhe would want to be in where Fiorina wouldn't, while also doing the same job Shenhe does, but better. That's her main issue right now. She's a 5-star niche substitute of another 5-star unit. Why use Shenhe when you can use Fiorina, who also just so happens to work better with 4-star supports than Shenhe does? There's really no point. Up next is Yunjin, who's currently the worst buffing support in the game. There's currently no DPS in the game that wants her over any other buffing support. She's Geo, so she can't provide reactions, requires building into her buff to be useful, yet she has harsh energy requirements. She's a niche normal attack buffer, which only buffs 4 characters specifically, and she has no utility or damage other than damage buff she provides. She's just not good right now, and you will be much better off going with another unit that offers off-field damage plus a little bit of utility, like a C0 Kachina or C0 Lisa. Yae Miko is up next in the A tier. Yae is a rather good DPS at the moment. Her ability to flex as a main and sub DPS is her largest asset, as it allows her to be flexible with rotations and team comps. Her ability to apply Electro from off-field also makes her a great substitute for Fischl in a lot of cases. On top of that, she got buffed pretty dramatically from the release of Fiorina, who enables even better forms of Quick Bloom comps and Chevreuse, who can support overload specific compositions. Hayato, on the other hand, didn't get so much love. Hayato is a main DPS that's not doing so hot. He's the jack of all trades but master of none, and that's really impacting him right now. His flexible nature used to be a benefit, as it allowed him to function very well in Bloom teams, but with Fiorina raising the damage floor and ceiling, Hayato ends up getting left behind teams that focus on more raw damage. Yelan is going into S- tier. Yelan used to be worse than Xingqiu, but now she's better, so why is she lower than him? While she cannot act as a solo hydro applicator in some teams, when paired with Fiorina, it it would apply Hydro through any aura, while also massively boosting the damage of the on-field unit by up to 125%. On top of that, they both unlock Hydro Resonance for each other to scale off of, increasing their damage even further. So why is Yelan a tier below Xingqiu? Yelan plus Furina are an absolute powerhouse together, but if not paired, Yelan becomes unnecessary. Xingqiu is the defensive Hydro support DPS, while Furina is the offensive version. Yelan is the weaker version of Furina, but without the healer requirement, making her the best offensive Hydro support when using specifically shields. Otherwise, Yelan is not as useful anymore. Kuki Shinobu is going into the A+ tier. While not as relevant as she was before, the healer Kuki Shinobu is still a strong powerhouse in Hyperbloom related team comps. Her damage may be huge, but her healing is what really keeps her as the go-to unit for all Hyperbloom teams, to the point where she's still the best in slot support or one of the top 3 main DPS units in the game. Outside of Hyperbloom teams, she's effectively useless though, unless you need an electro defensive support for whatever reason. Heiso is going to go into the C+ tier. Heiso is a pretty decent DPS buffer hybrid. He has some gripping, some damage, some elemental mastery buffing, and he can wield the Viridescent set. He's a solid pick, but he is lacking compared to other Anemo units who have better buffs, better damage, and or off-field presence. His main issue is that he doesn't excel at one thing, and he doesn't have any off-field presence, rendering him as a pretty underwhelming unit overall. Now starting off Sumeru, we have Klee, who's going to go into D tier. Klee was broken on launch, but has fallen off due to her low damage and oddly bursty Dendro application. She applies a lot of Dendro, but has an oddly long on-field requirement for an off-field character, and her application does not last long. She's really only good as a Nilo Bloom enabler and or as an elegy buffer. If not using her in this spot, she will be severely outclassed by many other Dendro units, including the Dendro Traveler. Ignari is up next, and he's going into B-. Ignari is a great quickswitch DPS that can deal huge bursts of damage alongside other units. He has a low requirement and performs very well against a single target, but can struggle severely against AoE. He also has some awkward team setups that have little room for replacements and variations. He's just a decent character with good upsides and downsides. The thing that puts him slightly below is that he's missing out on that one character who has a good amount of role consolidation for him. When that character's launched, it's probably going to end up in the B or B+ tier. He's still just a solid character overall. Dori, though, is going to go into D tier, since each benefit she comes with has massive cons. She does have the highest rate of triggering Hyperbloom in the game, but it requires such fine-tuned positioning that it's useless. It might be a battery, but she requires an immense amount of energy for herself to use her battery potential. She's also a healer, but her healing doesn't scale too well, and it's only for a single target. Dori is so underwhelming that she's better played as an on-field Hyperbloom driving tank instead of an actual support when she's at C6. However, we are currently not in a transformative reaction meta, and instead we're in one where raw damage is king, putting Dori in the D tier as one of the worst characters in the game. Candace will go into the C- tier. Candace is an offensive support unit who has good, but not enough of it. She's a lot like Yunjin in that she's a normal attack buffing support, but her buff is percent based and not base damage based, making it much worse than Yunjin's. However, she comes with 2 benefits in slow AoE Hydro application, and she grants the on-field unit a Hydro fusion. These do sound good, but so many units benefit much more from fast Hydro application instead of slow Hydro application, and so many units have innate infusions that turns Candace into mostly a worse Yunjin. The only units that prefer to use her over others are Arlecchino, who is the only Pyro main DPS who can make more use of the slow AoE Hydro application and normal attack percent damage bonus than anyone else, and Xiao, who can use the infusion to drive in Nilo teams. Up next is Sino, who I'm going to put into C- as the now worst 5-star DPS in the game. I think that I was a little too happy with Sino in my last tier list, so I'm correcting that now. Sino is a hyper carry DPS that suffers from having an inherently flawed design. Sino has the potential to deal some of the highest damage in the game, but it comes at the cost of pretty much everything. This unit has incredibly harsh stat requirements that he needs a total of 5 different stats, which is almost twice the amount than most other units. He also is the only hypercarry main DPS that requires a specific elemental aura to function, as without the Dendro aura, Sino's damage would plummet into the 3-star character category. If the Dendro aura is not applied to an enemy, Sino would have to be swapped off-field, and it loses hypercarry uptime in order to reapply the Dendro element. This is usually not an issue, but currently there is no single unit in the game that can properly apply the Dendro aura to enemies for Sino to deal damage except when he's used against a single target with Nahida. This issue became even prevalent with the release of Furina, who ended up increasing the damage of Sino's off-field party members, leading to more damage during Sino's uptime. The more damage Sino deals, the less uptime he has, and the more energy hungry he is, because you need to swap off of him to reapply the Dendro element. This would increase the amount of energy recharge stats Sino requires, or it would increase the rotation times of the team in order to battery Sino back up. This means that while she did turn out to be a buff for Sino against single target content, Furina would end up nerfing Sino's team damage when up against AoE content, to the point that any other Electro unit would perform better. Sino is a very flawed character because he needs a Dendro unit that can apply a lot of Dendro in an AoE around Sino while off-field and passively. That character currently does not exist, and until then, he will remain as the worst 5-star DPS in the game. Nilo is going to go up into the A tier. Nilo is a very powerful support unit that enables the Bloom reaction to actually deal damage. She does this passively and by building into only HP, but her teams are incredibly restrictive in the way they're built. She can only be paired with Hydro and Dendro units, she needs to be used alongside a healer to heal the self-damage Bloom deals, and she needs units with a heavy amount of both Hydro and Dendro application. Bloom teams also don't scale well in single target content because they produce significantly less Bloom cores compared to AoE content. This makes Nilo an incredibly niche character, though when her restrictions are fulfilled, her teams that are made of pure support units can deal a tremendous amount of damage. Nahida is the Dendro Archon and she's going into S. Nahida is an incredibly powerful offensive support and sub-DPS hybrid that still holds up as the best Dendro unit in the game. This is mostly because of the insane elemental mastery buff she can grant the on-field party member, plus the large amount of control application she can apply on a whim. Her damage is nothing to scoff at either, especially when used in Quicken related teams, as she has some of the best off-field damage in the game at that point. Nahida is insane and continues to be incredibly strong to this day since she pairs well alongside Furina and because she is one of the best burning and urgent enablers in the game. Layla is up next and she's going into D+ tier. Layla is a shield support that has not seen a lot of love in a long time. On release, she had one of the strongest shields in the game with no caveat, but she provides little other than her shield. And in an era that desires healers over shielders, Layla has fallen behind severely over other defensive supports. Peruzan is up next and she's going into A tier. Peruzan is the best niche buffing support in the game because she's able to buff her own raw damage, and her damage is freaking huge. Because her own damage is ridiculous, she can even be used outside of her own niche as a viridescent Fenrir support for any team, especially since she can group enemies from off-field, though it's not super strong. She also received a ludicrous damage increase from the addition of Furina. This is the point that I would consider Peruzan to be one of the best Anemo characters in the game, which is kind of crazy, especially since the Anemo roster is so freaking goated. Speaking of, Wanderer is going to go into the B tier. Wanderer is a very versatile main DPS unit that can also be used as a support. However, in this current day and age, his okay single target oriented damage relies too much on getting massively buffed by Bennett, Peruzan, and Furina, and even in those teams, Peruzan can out DPS Wanderer in a good amount of situations. The only other option he has is to help buff his off-field damage dealers using Viridescent Vermeer as a driver DPS, but that is almost never as valuable as dealing damage. All of these things put a Wanderer behind most other 5-star DPS units by quite a bit, but still not enough to make him bad. That's not that desirable. Alhaitham, on the other hand, is a main DPS driver that puts in work. This guy is currently the 3rd best DPS unit in the game. His personal damage is huge, his Dendro application is fast enough for him to apply Dendro to his targets with ease, and he works well in every Quicken related team. His only downside is his lack of versatility, since without Quicken, he deals pitiful damage. He also does not scale well with attack, and doesn't work well with the Pyro and Cryo elements, which means he will potentially fall behind other units from here on out, but even then, he will stay as one of the best main DPS options in the game. Yao Yao is going to go into B+. Yao Yao is an overall good support healer. Her main use case is to heal, but she also offers some of the best off-field Dendro application. On top of that, she pairs incredibly alongside Furina due to her team-wide passive healing. Her main downside are that she offers little other than healing, her team-wide healing can be awkward to use, and her Dendro application can be inconsistent. But outside of those issues, she's an overall strong healer, useful in all team comps that would want Dendro application. Kaeya is going to go into D+, which is quite a boost up from the F tier where she was before. Kaeya is an amalgamation that used to contend with a few others for the worst character in the game, but Furina and Nuvilette brought new light into this unit. Kaeya is currently one of the best off-field pyro applicators in the game, as her application is only behind the likes of Zhongli and Xinyan. This keeps her in a decent spot until another stronger pyro applicator comes out, at which point she will be rendered pretty useless once again. Mika is going to go into the C- tier. Mika is a healer and offensive support lumped into one. This should make him outstanding, but his main issue is that he's a niche physical support. This archetype is incredibly underwhelming due to his lack of support and lack of good stable characters, though Mika's instead usually paired alongside with Fiorina as a healer or an on-field DPS that can make use of the attack buff he provides like Yoimiya. Otherwise, he's not that great. Baizhu is going to go into the A- tier. Baizhu is an incredible Dendro defensive support. This is because he has all forms of defensive utility in his kit while also applying Dendro and granting the active character a flat damage buff to their Dendro-related reactions while off-field. This unit is a powerhouse of a support and will be the go-to for many Dendro teams. Kaveh is next and he's going into D-. Kaveh is a pretty underwhelming main DPS unit. His role is quite odd and confusing. His kit pushes him to build into Elemental Mastery as a Bloom driver, but Hydro units will usually be the ones dealing Bloom damage, though building Kaveh with Elemental Mastery is pretty useless. Instead, you'll want to build him as a DPS, but his scalings are incredibly poor for that role. Kaveh is an incredibly confused design that, in retrospect, is clear it was made to fail, earning him a spot in the top 5 worst characters in the game. Kirara is going into B tier. Kirara is a very stable defensive support. Her shield is one of the strongest in the game, but that's not the main reason why you pick her. The largest reason is her personal damage, which has pretty strong multipliers, and her team-wide percent damage buff. While these things are not the best in the game, they are still very solid and, more importantly, very useful. She's also one of the only units in the game that can apply Dendro even if the on-field unit uses a charged attack, which is super useful for teams that want to keep the Pyro aura active. And now we're on to Fontaine, starting off with Lynette, who's in C+ tier alongside Hazo. Lynette is a sub-DPS animal support. She is a good free-to-play option for her non-restrictive attack percent bonus, and because she can wield the Viridescent Varir set. Lynette also has the ability to group enemies with her taunt and her vortex, but that's about it. In comparison to other 4-star animal units, her ability to taunt enemies and her attack buff are what make her stand out, but these stats are only situationally beneficial to attack scaling teams that don't plan to use reactions and against heavy enemies that are not traditionally groupable. However, damage usually matters more against heavy enemies, and Elemental Mastery scales significantly harder in most teams. But due to her off-field presence, I think she is an okay side grade to Hazo, since they each have their own pros and cons over each other. Her magician brother, Linny, is going into A tier as his damage is huge. Linny is a burst DPS unit with one of the largest burst potentials in the game. However, he requires specific mono pyro teams, else he'd lose out on a tremendous amount of damage. His charge attack playstyle also prevents from using some of the better support units, though he's usually forced to use Bennett, Xiangling, and an animal character, a Dendro character, or Fiorina to be usable. Remine is going into D+. Remine is the other main DPS of this blonde trio, and well, is not that great. Remine is a physical main DPS that is forced to rely on Fiorina for his team to deal damage because of his low scalings. She might buff Remine, but she'd also buff his off-field teammates so much that they'd end up out-damaging him. Remine is just not good right now, and he needs more in order to be decent, else he'd remain as one of the worst DPS units in the game. Neuvillette, on the other hand, is going into S+ tier. When it comes to figuring out who the best character in the game is, we knew that the Hydro Archon was going to be the top contender for this spot. However, what wasn't anticipated was the absolute absurdity that came with the release of Neuvillette. The Hydro Sovereign might have damage that's only accessible from on-field, but that is his only downside, since he has literally everything else. Neuvillette can act as the tank for the team due to his insane self-sustain and huge AP pool. He can act as the healer for the team when he's used with Prototype Amber, and he's the main DPS, which is his main role. His main source of damage also does not rely on a cooldown, and he has one of the best battery potentials of any character in the game due to his low skill cooldown. These factors enabled Neuvillette to be the first character who would consistently and easily solo clear the Spiral Abyss at C0. He is a ridiculously overpowered character that completely took over the game on his release to the point of memeage. Neuvillette is currently the best DPS in the game, and because he has so many other defensive benefits that allow him to solo content or support his team, he's a contender for the best character in the game. Risley is next, and he's the main DPS that also serves as a tanky elemental applicator for certain teams. This allows him to act as a support in many roles that other cryo units would not be able to function within. This sort of versatility is what pushes him into a strong place, because without it, he'd be only a decent DPS with just good single target damage. Charlotte is next, and she's going into C tier, right above Mika. Charlotte is an odd healer sub-DPS hybrid. Her healing is strong, and her damage plus cryo application is okay when against AoE content. Her main issue is that she requires a ridiculous amount of on-field time for a healer in order to apply her enhanced skill to enemies and generate the most energy. This ends up reducing her team's damage in many situations to the point that she is mostly used as a freeze enabler for freeze teams when paired with Furina. Otherwise, she'll usually act as just a worse version of Miko. Furina is up next, and she is a contender for the best character in the game, like Noelle, because she only has one downside. Furina is a monster of a sub-DPS unit that massively buffs the entire team's damage by 75%. She does this while also applying Hydro to enemies unconditionally from off-field, plus with permanent uptime, and while enabling every main DPS to utilize the Marais Hunter artifact set for the extra 36% crit rate. Her only downside is that she requires being used alongside a healer in order for her to stack her 75% damage bonus and to mitigate her team-wide self-damage. This is a fine requirement though, because when this is fulfilled, Furina becomes the most overpowered character in the game, as her massive percent damage buff to the team plus monstrous personal damage make her the best unit alongside every single DPS unit in the game. This puts her alongside Noelle as a contender for the best character in the game, though in my personal opinion, Furina would be the best. Navia is an A-tier main DPS unit and deal a massive amount of burst damage. However, that's all she does, and her damage is only single target oriented, much like Linny. Despite that, she is still one of the best DPS units in the game because her damage floor and ceiling are high while also being easy to use. Chevriz is a healer that has massive buffing capabilities. However, like Nilo, she has a harsh team comp restriction that aims to make a bad team good. In order for Chevriz to get the most out of her percent damage bonus, attack percent, and resistance shred modifiers, she needs to be with only Pyro and Electro party members. However, the benefit is totally worth it. As the benefit, she grants a ridiculously overpowered damage increase for the entire team that surpasses all other buffing supports. Her only downsides are her harsh team restriction and her lack of personal damage, but if she did have those things, she would be the most busted unit in the game. Daming is going to go into A-. Daming is a plunge attack DPS and is the best 4-star main DPS in the game by a mile. Daming has such an insane damage output using his plunging attacks that it rivals most 5-star main DPS units and surpasses some of them. Daming is so incredibly strong in all situations due to his decently sized AoEs and huge damage multipliers. On top of that, he has some decent self-sustain, making him pretty good without any defensive support. Chongyun is going to go into A tier. Chongyun is a team-wide healer that also enables all units to use their plunge attacks while buffing them too. This utility enables some insane damage outputs for many DPS in the game, to the point that she enables almost every character in the game to reach a new DPS ceiling. Chongyun plus Furina plus Bennett offers so many buffs to any DPS that they can turn any unit in the game into a strong and proper main DPS. Chongyun's larger issue though is that she relies too much on this specific comp, and Furina specifically, to be powerful. Without this comp, she only excels at buffing Gaming and Xiao, while Jean, a standard banner unit, would be slightly better in all other circumstances, which is why they're right next to each other. Chiori is going to go into B- tier. Chiori is a sub-DPS unit that deals a tremendous amount of damage but has to rely on only one comp in order to function. If not used in this one comp, she performs significantly worse because no other comp can support her effectively. This makes her the most niche unit in the entire game, with little to offer other than top-tier sub-DPS damage output. Arlecchino is the current second best DPS in the game. Her damage at a base is ginormous, which enables her to be used in basically every type of pyro composition in the game. On top of that, she has innate resistances to all forms of damage, and she can heal herself to full when using her elemental burst. This unit is one of, if not the tankiest main DPS unit in the game, to the point that using her with Xingqiu or Beidou makes her near immortal. Her main issues are that she can't be used with Furina since she cannot be healed by anything other than her elemental burst, her damage cannot be activated on command, and she cannot deal with mobs super well. But outside of that, she has almost everything, making her the second best main DPS in the game, just behind the one that does everything. Orange is a main DPS, but she's also a completely self-sufficient tank. This is what she's balanced around, similar to Riesli, as her raw damage is not the best. Instead, she's balanced more around quad DPS comps, since she plus Furina are enough to sustain the team. This enables her to be used in almost every Electro team very well as a DPS. However, she currently has a bit too much of a reliance on Fischl for team DPS, which is a bit of a shame. Thethos is another main DPS, but he's going to go into D- because of his plethora of issues. Scalings are quite low, his uptime is bad, his kit incentivizes 2 different playstyles and splits its buffs from his passives into each build instead of buffing both. He CCs himself, he has no utility, Thethos is just not good. The only thing he has going for him right now is Hyperbloom in order for him to deal with his lack of raw damage, but every other Electro character can can do the same thing while also having good damage. Qiqi is going to go into D tier. Qiqi is a healer that basically just heals. She also has a very niche and small buff for basically only Fiorina, which makes her okay as a Fiorina-specific buffing support. To almost all teams though, she offers nothing other than healing, which is not enough, and can even put her on par with Qiqi in some situations. It's just not a great character. Emily though is going to go into B+ tier. Emily is a very powerful off-field damage healer who has insane scaling. She has 3 particular issues though. As a single target focused, she will usually not have her damage buffed, and she has to be used in burning-related teams. She cannot be used anywhere else without her damage being halved or worse. But in the situation that those conditions are met, she still has one of the highest damage outputs of any sub-DPS in the game. Moalani is one of the newest characters released into the game, and she has proven to be one of the best main DPS units. This is specifically when against single-target content, as she is the current best speedrunning unit out there. This is because of her huge multipliers with her ability to forward vape off of the Pyro Aura, which dramatically boosts her damage. These things make her one of the best damage dealing units in the game, but damage is all she can do, and sometimes she can be pretty inconsistent, especially when against moving targets. She also has very tight damage dealing windows, which can make her feel pretty crappy if you are unable to deal the damage she needs to deal in those short windows. Her desire for a large mechanical skill grants her the highest disparity in potential damage output of any main DPS unit in the game, which is why she is ranking lower than she really should. Gina has one purpose: to hold the new scroll artifact set. This set grants her team a 40% damage bonus to any element she crystallizes plus Geo, making her one of the best units in the game for supporting compositions that focus their damage around one element. This is her main use at the moment, and it's what makes her so good alongside units like Nuvilette and Linny. Kinich is a very powerful single-target DPS unit that can easily make short work of bosses. His base damage is huge too, which enables him to be used in many teams as long as Burning or Burgeon is triggered. His main issue is that he is super niche. Not only does he fire Pyro and Dendro to react off of one another, but he is limited to single-target scenarios, and he has nothing other than damage when he's on field. He can also distance himself just out of Zhongling's Pyronado's range, forcing you to have to use Toma or Dea Pyro application. And since he moves around with the enemy, it's actually pretty easy for him to leave Bennett's circle if they are pretty mobile. This means that Kinich's teams will rely strictly on Mavuika whenever she is released, in which case he's dealing significantly less damage than he should be. Until then, his best teammate is any that applies Pyro because he has pretty much nothing else to work with, making him Emily but worse since she can be used off-field. Xiaoling is up next, and she is going into S tier. Xiaoling is making her way to be the best defensive support in the game, and currently one of the best characters in the game. She offers slightly less than Kazuha in terms of buffs, but she can completely make up for it by taking up that defensive support slot. Xiaoling is way too good and earns a very solid S tier alongside Kazuha. While she does not offer the same practical damage increase that Kazuha offers due to his powerful personal damage and grouping in AoE content, she makes up for it with much more consistent buffs. This makes her slightly better against single target, but Kazuha completely wipes the floor with her when against AoE because he's just ridiculous. The application also enables him to make his allies' reaction triggering much more consistent, which Xiaoling cannot do. I could also take this comparison over to Bennett. While Bennett is a much more beneficial support to more units, Xiaoling is a better buffer when she's used alongside HP scaling hydro characters like Fiorina, Nuvilette, Yalan, and Walani, or when she's used with an off-field Geo, Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo damage dealer who cannot snapshot Bennett's attack buff like Yae Miko. These gives and takes when compared to other S tier units earns her a spot in the same tier. Chasca is a very powerful main DPS unit that can be used in a wide variety of compositions. Her damage is high, she's evasive, she can apply all types of elements. Chasca can do a lot other than support her team. Her damage is easily accessed too, and she can clear all content very easily. She is the versatile damage dealer that will always be valuable, putting her in a rather good spot. Ororon seems to be a great character for specifically electrocharged teams. He offers a lot of utility in team-wide damage percent and attack percent buffs, energy regen for his main DPS, some grouping from his taunt, and some pretty strong damage. He's essentially the Chevruz of electrocharged that, instead of healing, offers damage but less offensive buffs. This puts him in a rather stable spot as the character in a niche similar to Chevruz. His only issue is that he's very replaceable because he's not a defensive support for his teams. Why run Ororon when you can run Fiorina and or Yalan or Kazuha, who all offer much stronger damage and better offensive utility than Ororon? If he was a defensive support, at least he wouldn't be competing for the same spot out as these units, who all do his job but better. But that's it for my tier list today. Now I want to hear your thoughts. What do you think about these placements? Do you think that this was a fair assessment? Do you believe someone is overrated or heavily underrated? Is there something you think I forgot to mention? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. But with that, I will skedaddle. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in my next Genshin video about Mavuika. Bye bye!